Today on Tabletop Odyssey, Anya Lycarayen is embarking on a new business venture, expanding condor rails right through the Cult of December's mountainous homeland. But before planning applications can be made, she needs to gather some intel on the subject and clear out the trash. I'm going to be bringing Anya to the rail Magnate to this conflict with 4 stones to spare. Sovereign leads the ranks as her formidable totem, with the loaded investor Winston Finnigan, flush with cash, riding in on his dirigible. In her retinue, she has gathered the services of Irena and Altus Keene, here to plan a funeral of sorts. The cold-blooded Corvis Rook, his pockets full of cash too, and the unfortunate rail ghost of Cayce Jones. The plan here is to construct the Great Wall of Anya and create a stopgap in which they're forced to come through, one at a time, to take on my execute users. Meanwhile, I'll drain their hand and stones with lots of duels from Not an Accident. My opponent is a little fresh-faced, unfortunately, and just getting to grips with Rasputina here, but is unfortunately a little naive on how Anya operates. They elect to take Rasputina 1, the Wendigo, she of 2 skins, in the form of Ceddra, a pair of December Acolytes, a silent one, the Blessed of December, and the giant crocodile Bashe. A fearsome threesome of beaters, backed up by some strong card filtering, scared my fragile force a little, but with only 4 stones and no arcane reservoir to be seen, I felt empowered to take advantage of their folly. The strategy for this mission was Cloak and Dagger on standard deployment, with a scheme pool of Ensnare, in your face, sweating bullets, deathbeds, and hold up their forces. My opponent elected to take In Your Face and Deathbeds, whilst I took Deathbeds and Ensnare. The reason I'm taking Deathbeds is because I have a lot of ways to get out geodes, and the rate at which I'm putting them out, it feels like an easy win here. Whilst I was also confident that they would have taken the same on Ice Pillars. Irena and the Drudges would be on cleanup duty for those, and with 2 models with Don't Mind Me, with Corvis having draw out secrets on his melee in addition, it meant that Ensnare also felt fairly easily for me to accomplish here. Besides, I can always just drag a scheme up with a Drudge into place too. My opponent took In Your Face because a very high wounded Bashe here would probably live a long time to reach my deployment zone, and they had enough heavy duty models to be able to kill something near my master. Turn 1, the Arcanists are going to take the run of things as a silent one makes a pillar and focuses up. Winston is going to start my unpack, riding Cayce up in his balloon and dropping a scheme for a Drudge to appear for me. Then filters out some cards with Fortune's Favour. An exceptional ability, that. Rasputina is then going to December's Passage around that pillar to thrust her disciples forwards. Unfortunately fails to create another pillar, but decides to smack a Drudge for 2 damage with her Wintry Blast, smashing some damage onto Winston, but I'm able to counter a further attack. Cayce Jones is then going to rock slide a trio of geodes into play, creating a nice wall blocking off Rasputina's line of sight, whilst getting the trigger on his whistle to heal my injured Winston and Drudge. The Blessed of December then moves up and interacts with an intel, but fails to leap, leaving him a little in the way. Altus Keene is going to saunter himself up, give his sister some concealing, and start throwing geodes at Rasputina, who is going to take 2 damage from the little rumble. Bashe is then going to walk up into place, finding himself squarely behind the Blessed. Unable to get a little further. Sovereign is going to fly Corvis up the field, grabbing some intel for myself. The male Acolyte is then going to smash through a Drudge before taking a shot at Sovereign, plinking him for damage and pulling him closer. Irena takes the opportunity to ambush before slamming some more geodes into Raspi's face for a further 2 damage. Hopefully I can take some cards out of her hand soon. Ceddra is then going to move up beside the croc, preparing itself for some conflict. Anya is going to load up her list of orders here, sending Cayce in to charge Rasputina behind his great wall that I can see through, but not them, with my 2-inch engagement engaging them, but they're also not engaging me. This is a fantastic play here. We've also pinned her against the wall on one side, so she really has only one avenue of movement to get out of here. He's going to do 4 damage and apply slow to her, so she is forced to remove that nearby pillar to avoid the damage. Anya is then going to order Irena to execute through the Blessed off a dazzling flourish, taking away one of their stones. The Wendigo is then going to move up, surprisingly not making any pillar or healing Raspi at this occasion, to my shock, allowing Corvis to remove the evidence of a nearby scheme, pick up the red joker from the top of my deck, which is going to prove mightily useful, and then move forward and summon his own Drudge off another scheme marker. These will be proving very useful later on. The female Acolyte is then going to move up next to an intel marker, ready to grab it next turn, before focusing to end the turn. Turn 1 finished, I'm feeling pretty confident here, and turn 2, I'm going to seize the initiative, going with Cayce Jones to pummel Rasputina, cheating in the red joker that I'd picked up on my damage, meaning she has to reduce it with a stone. They're then going to create a pair of geodes in order to fuel Irena, and then block off some of the Blessed's movement and the Wendigo's line of sight. The Silent One is realizing they're going to need to do some healing and decides to pump up Raspi, only getting her for 1, unfortunately, which allows Anya to take the opportunity to order Cayce to create another Drudge before asking Irena to charge the Blessed of December. Raspi is then forced to disengage from the conflict, taking damage from some geodes, but I managed to reduce the movement to 0, so she has to try again to escape. The damage is of course adding up here. She then unfortunately fails to make a pillar, so she's not really accomplished too much this turn. Altus is then going to teleport to his sister and ram a pillar into the Silent One to plink for some more damage. The Blessed of December takes a giant swipe at Altus, dealing a whooping 4 damage, activating his swirling illusions, allowing me to stop his follow-up punch. The Blessed is then going to fail to leap, roadblocking his own Bashe behind him, and Ceddra. This is going to prove a massive mistake. My pretty boy Drudge is then going to drag a scheme marker into position for me, and Ceddra is going to charge full speed into both of the Keenes, smashing through a further 3 damage into Altus Keene, leaving him hanging by a thread on 1 health. Sovereign fails to fly Corvis to the rescue, so just decides to run up to an intel marker for the next turn instead. The male Acolyte is then going to murder a Drudge, puts 2 damage into another, while Winston fails to bring Corvis into the fray too. Winston then decides to resummon a Drudge, and then scoot up, having moulded my deck with Fortune's favour. The female Acolyte is then going to grab some intel marker, move forward to get to it next turn, in strategic position here, as Corvis is going to remove yet more evidence, charge into the Wendigo and smash them for 3 damage and staggered, ripping a card out from their hand with the execute trigger I built in. The Wendigo is then going to disengage and move away from Corvis, retreating, but not so far away that they can't catch up due to their stagger. The giant Drudge is then going to start a union with the Syndicate Goon Squad, bumping up a little bit of health here. And Bashe is forced to focus, just stuck between a tree and the Blessed of December, with nowhere really to go, making some sad crocodile noises here. Irena is going to smash the Blessed of December with a geode for 3 damage total, pinging them, and then 2 off of the shockwave there. Raspi is forced to use a stone here to save themselves, but the Silent One is accidentally splattered. I do promise it was an accident. She is then going to flourish into Ceddra and trying to execute it, which forces them to use their last stone to save it. This was crucial, as because they were forced to save the stone for the execute, it was coming rather than saving the Silent One. Rasputina is now out of stones, not on a lot of health here. Things are going to get a lot easier for me going into the next turn, as it ends 1-1, as we both are able to discard some intel. On turn 3, I'm going to cheat quite high here in order to save Altus Keene before he is destroyed. He's going to reward me by stripping a card from their hand before smacking the Blessed of December with a geode to the face. He is unfortunately going to fail to incognito with the Black Joker. Unable to escape into Irena's safety, he decides he's just going to have to accept his fate, decides to take the Blessed of December with him, who just so happens to also die from a rather inconvenient workplace accident. Rasputina marginally avoids death again by cheating, leaving only 2 cards left in their hand and no stones for them to spare. It's looking pretty worrying for the rest of the turn. Bashe is finally free to do some work here, however, and he's going to use his bonus to remove a geode before devouring Altus with a savage bite and healing the spiky rock damage off. Irena does not like being bitten, however, kicking them away with her metal legs and making sure they forget about her. Anya is then going to give Irena her orders to interact, attempting to set up Ensnare on Ceddra, before Anya walks into range to exert control on Ceddra. Unfortunately, she fails to do so, so just decides to lock down that scheme marker Irena has placed, stopping Ceddra from attacking near it. The female Acolyte is then going to pick up the red Joker that they just flipped in defense, and then interacts to grab the intel marker before moving back towards it. Irena ambushes around to the other side of Ceddra instead, walking to get the distance before interacting to secure the Ensnare. The Wendigo is then going to copy Rasputina's freeze over to heal them both for a smidge, before eating a corpse to heal them back to full. The pretty boy is then going to decide he also wants to unionize, creating a wall of flesh for me here. So Rasputina is forced to slam away a geode, plinking herself for a point of damage, before freezing over to heal herself again, before putting down a pillar near Cayce and December's passaging Bashe into the melee, with Cayce and Corvis. Perhaps not the most efficient use of her turn. Girl Power Drudge is then going to unionize as well before dragging a scheme into place near a geode and Bashe. Trying to set myself up here for deathbeds. Ceddra is ensnared now before disengaging and manoeuvring away. Winston is then going to get his dirigible ride working for a Drudge and rides along to claim me some intel, while his male Acolyte grabs some more for them too. Cayce is then going to discard a card to avoid slow from the pillar, grabbing me the intel under his feet before creating a rock slide near the croc. Sovereign is then going to Thunderstruck near Rasputina, who's going to cheat to survive before moving to trigger Sound of Thunder. They managed to avoid it, however. Finally, the giant goon then goon squads again, before Corvis charges in and delivers a decisive blow. 14 wounds, undamaged, but no cards left and no stones remaining. The price of progress is sometimes executing a marauding crocodile on full health. It's hard to watch, but my opponent has learned a painful lesson here about Anya Lycarayen, and that is one I sincerely hope they won't make again. Turn 3, they score on intel, while I'm also scoring intel, as well as deathbeds on Bashe and Ensnare on Ceddra. 4-2 to Anya. Turn 4, and Rasputina is now on the ropes a little, slightly tilted from losing the croc. So she is then going to drop a pillar on Irena before sending a frost to cool her for 3 damage. Pretty boy walks up, slams the pillar to dust. He says that they're not remark removal. Ceddra is then going to charge into Irena, hoping to clear her out, dealing a whooping 4 damage to her, whilst Winston decides to collect some intel, shape my deck for me, and then fly Cayce away from the pillars, so I'm not having to discard a card. The male Acolyte is then going to grab some more intel for himself, and Cayce is grabbing me some for himself too, before smashing in a rock slide near Ceddra. Sovereign is then going to Thunderstruck near Rasputina, forcing her to cheat to save herself, before charging in and crushing her to death within his claws. Unfortunately, she was not on a lot of health remaining. The female Acolyte is then going to shoot Irena, cheating high, and the bullets cleaving through her shroud to kill her, scoring in your face as her body falls near Anya. My giant Drudge is then going to charge the male Acolyte, stopping them from interacting with intel, who is then forced to kill it near Corvis, which will feed me a stone from Flush with Cash. Girl Power is then going to drag a scheme forward into place for deathbeds, while Anya orders Winston to gather some intel for me, ordering Cayce to walk around a pillar, preparing him to take some intel himself, and then interacts to summon the giant Drudge back for me. Cayce is then going to interact with the intel marker, fails to hit Ceddra unfortunately, but leaves them in an interesting position. Corvis charges down the male Acolyte, drawing out his secrets, giving me 2 options for Ensnare at the end of the game. I'm pretty happy with things so far, taking a point for intel, denying it from my opponent, as well as my opponent. They've managed to grab in your face here. So a point for each of us, 5-3 going into the final turn. Turn 5, unfortunately, is more of a funeral than a fight here, as Ceddra is turning into Sightless Snow to drop a pillar, using their bonus to drop a scheme, clearly aiming for some deathbeds here, and then tries to gore Cayce for 3 damage. Girl Power is basically a pass token now, so I just smidge up my scheme to guarantee some deathbeds, and I attempt to go in for max points as Sovereign is going to run off and grab me some intel. That's 1 of 4. The female Acolyte then analyzes weakness on Cayce, shoots him for 2, unfortunately unable to kill him to score deathbeds here. They're going to feel a little hard done by. I clear up here as Anya orders Winston to walk, Cayce to move, and then exerts control onto Ceddra to drop a scheme, which will guarantee me Ensnare as there is no one nearby to remove them. The giant Drudge is then going to move forward, dragging his scheme into place. That's 2 there now. Whilst Corvis is going to steal the male's Acolyte's intel. Price of progress, the trigger on Breck Room dealings to scoot away and interact with the intel myself. So that's 3 intel so far for me. The male Acolyte is then going to have to grab some intel from himself, unable to steal from Corvis. He's just going to shoot Corvis for the fun of it, but Corvis just chucks a pile of cash in his face and stops it. I'm just going to grab the last point intel that I need with Winston, which leaves the game with a punishing 8-3 in favour of Anya. Lessons learned. My opponent is still figuring out the ins and outs of Rasputina and learning the hard way about managing their hand and stones. They're looking forward to furthering their utilisation of upgrades more in future and learning how to get some more pillars out on the board for me to deal with. For me, Anya is one of my more experienced crews personally, and I feel pretty comfortable with how I've performed. But aside from being nasty, I could focus on denying my opponent more points as much as scoring them myself. I'm really loving the Great Wall of Anya, and I promise that all deaths within Condor Rail projects are absolutely purely accidental in nature. I want to give a massive thanks to my opponent and to Imps Gaming for hosting us, giving us a great time here, and continuing to provide such a safe haven for such a large group of Malifaux players. I hope you've enjoyed, so make sure, if you did, to subscribe for more. This has been Tabletop Odyssey, drawing out your secrets.